Yeah, as a journalist for about 34 years. I lived in Taiwan for 8 years, Hong Kong 5 years, Beijing 18 years, and Myanmar a little over a year. In 2012, I had to leave China to return to the US to get a new visa to work in China. And after I left, I waited about 8 months, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs turned down my request for a visa. They didn't give a reason, they just said under Chinese law, we can decide who gets a visa, that's true. So they never told me. I think I can guess, there might be several reasons. One was that I wrote a lot about human rights, social justice issues, religion, politics, so that might have upset people. But most of the other journalists wrote about the same things. I think they made a scapegoat of me. They wanted to kind of scare the other journalists, so if they kick me out, then everyone else gets a little bit nervous, and I think it had an impact. A few days after my visa was refused, it was actually big news because China doesn't kick people out often. In the last 14, 15 years, only 3 people, okay? So it was in the New York Times, Washington Post, LA, all the big newspapers wrote about it. And then one night, a Spanish journalist called me up, and he asked if he could interview me about my not being able to return to China. And I said, sure. And so I spoke to him on the phone about an hour. And then a few days later, he called me back and said, well, I'm not going to write my story now. It's November. I'm renewing my visa soon, because all the journalists have to renew their visas once a year, usually by November, December. He said, I'll write my story after I get my visa, okay? So you can see that he was a bit afraid. And so, my thinking is, when does November become October? When does October become September, August, if people are afraid to write things, So about 8 months before my visa was refused, I had to go to the Chinese consulate in San Francisco for an interview. That's it's been going on for a couple of years now. So I was interviewed by a secretary at the consulate, and we had a nice chat. We talked for over an hour. It was very friendly. And, but he said to me, at the end, he said to me, if we let you come back to China, we hope you'll be more objective. And I felt I was objective in my feeling. Now, to be fair, when I was in China, there were many Chinese people and many Westerners, Americans, who criticized me. They said I was anti-China, I was too negative, okay? I think that, at the end when the consulate officer said to me, is there anything you want to tell us? And I said, yes, I think the government's too sensitive. All of the journalists in China, the types of stories they do in China, they do in Taiwan, they do in Hong Kong, they do in Paris, they do in New York and London. No other governments get upset by this. It's the news, that's what happens. Now, I know Obama wasn't happy about things that were reported about him. Trump is not happy about what's reported with him, but it's not anti-American. I said to him, I'm thinking of doing a story now on street children, street people in Berkeley. And nobody in America will say I'm anti-American. But if I did a story on street people in China, oh, you're anti-China, okay? And I lived in Beijing for 18 years. I traveled in and out. First time I went to China was 1983. And so I have an affection for China. I had many Chinese friends. I traveled every place. The only province I didn't go to was Tibet, because it's very difficult for a foreign journalist to get permission. I applied many times. I was refused each time. And then also I think I really focused on human rights, social justice issues, because these were important to me. I grew up in the Bronx in New York. I don't know if you're familiar with the Bronx. It's getting better now, but when I was a child, it was a very bad area. A lot of crime. I have friends who were killed in the Bronx, were murdered, stealing money, things like that. My father was a building super, janitor. My mother was a house cleaner. And they struggled to survive. And I used to watch my mother and kind of worry. I could tell she was worrying for enough money to send me to school, for enough money for food, things like that. And so when I went to Taiwan, when I went to China, when I went to Mongolia, and I would see families that were poor, and I could see that they would tell me their stories. Their stories were far worse than mine, but I immediately thought, if I'm talking to an older person, I think, oh, that's like my mother. When I saw little girls in trouble, I said, oh, I have 2 daughters, that's my father, I could relate to the problems that people were having, and I felt a kind of an affinity for those people, and so this kind of guided me. Also, I read a lot. I read novels by John Steinbeck. And I don't know if you're familiar with of Mice and Men, the novel Mice and Men. Yeah. And it's a very sad story, but it's about migrant workers. Written by Steinbeck probably in the 1930s and 1940s. But it's about the difficulty of the life of migrant workers. It's not much different in some ways than the Chinese migrant workers who come to work in the factories. Probably worse back then. I've read Dickens. Charles Dickens influenced me. George Orwell, Orwell, 1984? He wrote a book called Down and Out in London and Paris. And in the book, he was kind of like, he was working in a kitchen in a restaurant in Paris, down in like the basement where they were cooking, and it was incredibly hot, and he was washing dishes. And he got sick, and he had no money for a doctor. And so he personally experienced what it's like to suffer. And then when he goes back to London, England, he travels with homeless people for 6 months. He pretends to be homeless, And so when you read these books, you get a strong feeling for how Orwell felt, sympathy for these people. He wrote another book about miners in England, the people working in the coal mines. And I was teaching journalism at the Chinese Broadcasting University, and I had my students read part of that, and I was surprised. I thought they would be bored. Okay, this isn't interesting. But they were actually quite excited. And then they told me they'd seen a Chinese documentary about coal miners in China, and they could relate to that type of thing. So this is what's kind of influenced me. Every time I did a sensitive story, I agonized about it. I thought, am I being fair? Am I being objective? In the 18 years that I was in Beijing, the government never once said, you lied. Or this is fake news, or they never said it to me. I know they weren't happy with all the stories I did, but they never said, oh, you distorted this story. So it's kind of surprising then, out of the blue, I really didn't expect it, my visa is rejected, But, that's what happens. So the stories that I did, I stay in touch with some of the people that I'll talk about today. I'm still in touch with, not all of them. These people are on WeChat, they're on QQ, and even though they're poor people, they use their mobile phones. A lot of them don't have computers, they're using their mobile phones to go on QQ and WeChat and WhatsApp and these types of things. So anyway, one of the toughest stories I did was called The Lost Boys. You might remember, must have been around 2007 or 6, there was a big news broke. It was about the black kilns. I think it's called Heizhuanyao. Do you know that? About 1,000 young Chinese boys, mainly farm boys, were kidnapped and sent to work mainly in Henan province, Henan and maybe Shanxi, and they were forced to work in brick kilns. Okay? I had a Chinese friend, her name was Jinyu. They called her Goldfish, but that wasn't the real name. And so she told me, oh, I'm working on a story on these boys who were kidnapped. And she asked me if I wanted to go with her, and I said, sure. So a few days later, we drove in Hebei province. We drove for hours, maybe 3, 4, 5 hours, to a mountain area, very kind of bleak. And I met a guy named Yuan Teng. He was a farmer in Hebei province. His house was one of the poorest houses I'd seen, dirt floor, and this is him in the house. Okay. I think another one. And this is his wife here. Most of the time, her eyes were red. Okay, I'll tell you the story. About a year earlier, her son was 15. He graduated from primary school to middle school. Well, primary school, it was a long, long walk to the school, but he could do it. In middle school, it was like 2 hours. After a couple of weeks, he just quit. And then about a bunch of his friends, 7 or 8 friends, they got a job in Zhengzhou doing construction, making buildings. if you have any questions, you can interrupt me. We'll have a question period later, but if you have questions, you can interrupt me. So, about, I guess, a week or 2 weeks later, I can't remember, he got a phone call from one of his sons. They were very excited, because they were going to go to work and make money. And the morning he left, they got up very, very early in the morning, around 5 o'clock. The sun was rising, maybe 6, and the mother made breakfast for him. And then, as he was leaving, he went outside. His father was going to take him on the motorcycle down to the highway to get the bus. As he was leaving, his little sister came out, 6 years old, and she ran up and said, "Don't go, don't go." And she grabbed him. And he said, "Oh, I have to go, I have to go." And he went to get on his father's motorcycle, and then he came back to the little girl. He bent over, and he whispered something to her. And then she said, "Okay," and then he left. And I asked the father, "What did your son say to your daughter?" And he says, I never asked her. I don't know. I never asked her, right? 2 weeks later, he gets a phone call from one of his son's friends, said, "Your son disappeared yesterday. He was working in a big building, new building, and they said, go up to, take this tool and deliver it up to the 14th floor. He never came back again." And so they don't know what happened to him. Just disappeared in a building, right? The father, the very next day, jumped on the train and went down to Jungdo, went to see the police. And the police said, "Oh, you have to wait 24 hours. And he waited 24 hours and went back, and they said, "Oh, maybe he ran away." And they had no interest in investigating. And he told me, he said, if this was their son or daughter, they would have investigated, okay? There was another young worker at the factory who'd been kidnapped the week before in a van, in a bus, and managed to escape. And he said, well, told the police this, "You should go interview him because maybe he knows where my son is." The police refused to do anything. So, Yuan with a bunch of other families, about 40 other families, they formed what we in English we call a vigilante group. It's kind of like a private police thing. And about every month or two, they would go out to Shanxi or to Henan, into the countryside, and they would go to the brick kilns, looking for their sons. That's a bit. This is him holding up a poster with one of the missing boys. This group of families, they would go out about 9 or 10 people each time, and they'd go to brick kilns. They saved about, I think, 50 boys. They rescued about 50 boys from the brick kilns. So they made a very nice lunch for us. The mother's crying in the background. You can see that. Okay. There you can see to her eyes are so red. How can you look at somebody and not feel, and I have 2 daughters, and sometimes I have a dream that my daughter didn't come home. And for the next 3 or 4 days I wake up, I have a bad feeling in my heart. It didn't happen, but it affects me. So the whole time I was with them, my heart was aching for them. There she's holding a picture of her son. I believe this is the only photo they had of him. Only one photo of him. And these are 2 young children that stopped by our car as we were driving out. And so these are kids who probably walked 40 minutes to school and 40 minutes back at that young age. And so on the following Monday, I met Chongyun at the Beijing train station with my reporter friend Jinyu, and we went down to Zhengzhou. And I started to notice that he was sad most of the time. He told me that after his son disappeared, somebody called up on the phone and they said, "Oh, I have your son. If you give me money, I'll give your son back." And then he said, "Well, let me talk to my son." And then he heard somebody call on the phone and said, "Baba, jiu wo." But he couldn't tell if it was his son's voice or not. He thought it was, but he wasn't sure. And then the guy hung up, and he never heard from the guy again. The police, again, didn't care when he told them. And, okay, hold on a second. And so we took the train down, overnight train to Zhengzhou, and I could see sometimes if I was talking to him, he would smile. The rest of the time he was and when he was serious, I could tell he's thinking about, where's my son? Can you imagine your son's missing? You don't know where he is. China is a huge country. Is he working in a coal mine? Is he working in a steel factory? Is he working in a brick kiln? You don't know where he is. Is he alive? Is he sick? Is he hungry? So you can see how. And when we got to Zhengzhou, they had this little group. There was a woman whose nephew was kidnapped. And this group, Chung Yuan and the other farmers, they rescued her nephew. He'd gone out going to see a movie one day, was standing on the corner, and a van pulled up, 3 women jumped out. He was only 14. And the woman said, "Do you want a job?" And he said, "No, no, I'm a student." They grabbed him, pushed him on the van, drove off. He disappeared. Okay? And so when they rescued her nephew, but when the nephew came back, he was not normal. He could never work again, he couldn't go back to school. He was so frightened by what had happened to him. And so she wrote a long essay called "The Blood and Tears of 400 Fathers," okay? And she put it on a blog. Well, the next day, that article went viral all over China. Everybody was reading it. And it was a very heartbreaking article. And then it became big news. And then the police stepped in and they shut down some of the kilns. But not all of them. And this was about 2 years before I did this story. And so my friend Gina said, "Do you want to do the story?" I said, "Oh, it's already been reported. It's over. They closed down the kilns." And she said, "No, no, the kilns are still open." And so that's when she and I went up, and my wife, Elaine, went up to see it. Don't change it. And one of the first people we met was this young man. He's about 17 now. And when he was 15, he went to Zhengzhou looking for a job. He wanted to work in a restaurant. And he was at the train station, a van pulled up, some people got out and said, "Oh, would you like a job?" And he goes, "Yeah, I want to work in a restaurant." "Okay, come with us." He got on with a bunch of other kids. The van drove out into the countryside, and he was delivered to a brick kiln to work, okay? He worked 10 to 15 hours a day, every day, 1 day off a month, no pay, and very little to eat, almost no meat, just like mantou, right? And he got really, really skinny. I saw another photo of him when he was very thin. And didn't get paid. And then he escaped. Very few people escape. They're afraid because the owners of the wrap pins are like mafia. They're connected with the local government. And he went to the local county seat, and he saw a sign on the door that said, "Labor Bureau." So he went inside and he said, "I was working at this kiln, and they didn't pay me." And so the Labor Bureau official said, "Okay, I'll get you your money, come with me." So he drove him to the kiln, and he got something like 1,000 RMB for like 10 months' work. He put 500 in his pocket, gave this boy 500, and then took him to another kiln and sold him for 500. Okay? So this is the second time he sold. He was sold 2 times to kilns. A few months later, he escapes again. This time, he goes back to the same town. The first person he sees is the guy from the Labor Bureau on the street. Takes him back, sells him to a third kiln. Now he's been sold 3 times. Okay? A few months after that, maybe 6 months, he escaped again. But this time, Chung Yuan and a bunch of farmers were going down the road, and his father had given them a photo, and they recognized him, and they saved him, took him to Zhengzhou. They got him a job in a restaurant. The boss is very good to him. And I had dinner, we had lunch together, and he couldn't look at me. He looked down the whole time. He couldn't make eye contact with me. That's how it affected him, being treated like a slave. And I said to him, "Well, what do you do when you're off or in the evenings?" He goes, "I don't leave the restaurant, I'm afraid. I'm afraid to leave the restaurant." He's afraid he'll be kidnapped again. We got to, so then we took the train, Jinyu, me, and Chung Yuan, we went down we were in Zhengzhou, and then Chung Yuan, and this woman, he kind of like uses fortune tellers to try to figure out where his son is. Can you tell me where he is in China? And so he went to 2 different fortune tellers. And this is another, this woman's son was kidnapped also, all right? And she was crying all the time. And she told him, "I know where your son is. He's either in the northeast or the southeast." And, "Oh, that's a big area." So Chung Yuan said, "Okay, first I'll go to the northeast, and then I'll go to the southeast." And then the woman told me, "I'm not always accurate." But she claimed she found 1 missing boy, okay? And, but he was like just desperate to find out. So then we went to every time he went to Zhengzhou to look for his son in the countryside, they would go to the temple there first, and they would kind of make offerings. And you can't see it here, but she's crying. She's the tears are coming down her face. Okay. Okay, this is the building where the son was working when he disappeared. So he took me there, we stood in front, he kind of described how he kind of tried to get the police to help him. And, okay. All right, we went to about a dozen kilns. When I got to Zhengzhou, the next day, about 9 other farmers came, okay? All rural people. And then we went to a park and they pulled out maps. And they said, okay, which place should we go to this time? Because every month, every 2 months, they go to a different place, hoping to find their children. And so he said that, well, in some areas it's dangerous because he said the owners of the kilns, he said were, if they were 100% black, right? 100% black, they were very evil, they would actually try to beat them. And so they would have to hide. But he said, the area we're going today, there are no black owners. So we spent about 2 or 3 days going to about a dozen kilns in the countryside. And it was interesting, was that these people, from searching for their children, they were like police. They were like a special police team. And we'd enter the kiln, and they would just spread out. And they would walk through the kiln, they would look in houses, in rooms, and they'd really, really search the place. Hoping to find. And we looked at, here's a young boy, he's probably like 18 or something, pulling this, the next one I mean. It's about 1,000 pounds. Here. I tried to pull it, it's not easy to pull. What we found out though was that all of the people in the kilns we went to, they weren't Han Chinese. They were all from Yunnan province. They were minorities, right? The Xiaozhou Minzu. Right? And what we think happened was, it was just after Chinese New Year. These families were putting so much pressure on the kilns that they decided to get rid of the Han Chinese and bring in and these people came from mountains in Sichuan province someplace, I think they were the Yi tribe. And that nobody knows where they are, and nobody cares where they are, right? And so then, Cheng Yuan and the other farmers were quite sad because they said, now, before we knew, okay, probably in Henan someplace, now we don't know. Could be all of China. We don't know where they are, but they're all gone. So every place we went, the workers now were not Han Chinese. They were, so all the people had replaced. They said, now we have to like search everywhere. Here's Cheng Yuan here. He was like Sherlock Holmes. You guys know Sherlock Holmes? He was like Sherlock Holmes. He saw, well, and I was surprised because he didn't. I think he went to the 6th grade, 5th grade, but from doing this, he became quite savvy. And he would go and he started asking people, where are you from? How much money do you make? How long have you worked here? Who's your boss? Did you see so-and-so? And I was standing there, like, taking notes. It was amazing how smart he was in kind of questioning and gathering information. This is my reporter friend. She's trying to pull the bricks. You know, this woman, her son, now, all of the people that some of the kids working in there are like 12, 13, 14 years old. There's a small number of girls. There's quite a few handicapped people, okay? And so this woman's son went out to buy cigarettes one night and never came home again, okay? She doesn't know what happened to him. He never came home again. She's pretty tough. She would even go out on her own. Cheng Yuan told me she would go on her own, and she'd go, and because it's kind of, I was scared. I was afraid every day because sometimes the owners would be kind of far away looking at us. They have big black sedans, like official cars and stuff, and they're sitting there like looking at us. And I thought, oh, they're gonna grab us, And so with this woman, she would go out on her own and go into Henan, into Shanxi, and she would go right in. And she told me, I'm not afraid. I would go in, they'd say, where are you going, where are you going? She said, I'm deaf, I can't hear, And she told people she was deaf. And when I was there, she just walked right into the dormitories and stuff, She's not afraid. She was the toughest one. And that's her son. And this woman here, really sad story. She was working in Xinjiang, and her son was 18 or something, and she sent him back home to Shanxi province, to Xi'an. No, I don't know where, someplace in Shanxi, but anyway, so he got on the train and with a friend. And then when the train pulled into Xi'an for a little while, he got off the train, never came back on. Never got back on the train. His friend said, he got off, he said, I'll be right back, never got back on again. She never heard from him again. So this kind of scares me when you think about it. It's like a mystery story. You know, a young boy gets off a train, he's gone. Nobody knows where he is. No clues or anything. She cried the whole time, like every day. And this is her son there. These are kilns in the background. They put up these search things all over the place looking for their sons. And she's crying there. This guy's son was in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. So he was probably 20 or 21 when he got kidnapped. And this guy had no photo of his son. This guy was very poor. Had no photo of his son. All he had was his son's, like, I guess ID card. That was it. The only photo he had of his son. So you can see how poor these people are. They don't even have photos of their family members. So after we spent about 2-3 days going to the kilns, then the driver, we'd rented a car, and the driver told us, you know, the owners have been telling me you better leave now. So the owners were upset, and they told the driver, if you don't leave, there's going to be trouble. So the farmer said, okay, it's enough, we want to go to Kaifeng now to look. So we went with them together back into the town, and we hired a van for them to take them to Kaifeng. But as they were leaving, before they got on the van, about a dozen police came. And all plainclothes police, and they surrounded us like this, and they all had video cameras, and they're filming us. And one of the farmers starts to, maybe it was Chungyuan, started to argue with the driver. Oh, he was going like, and they were like arguing over the price of the van. And then Jinyu has a lot of experience. Jinyu works for Nanfang Ramutokan, and she does a lot of reporting. And she was young, she was maybe 28. I was really impressed with her. I used to worry about her. Sometimes she'd call me up to, oh, I'm in Yunnan someplace, I'm in the mountains here. For a young woman to do this kind of reporting, not easy. And she kind of shoved them in the car and said, just go, don't argue. And then the police said, okay, come with us to have tea. And they grabbed her wrist. And she went, no, we gotta go. And we started walking, and the police were following us, they kept grabbing her. And she goes, no, we don't have time, we have to go. And so then finally, and there was no taxis in this town. It's a very rural town, no taxis. And so finally we saw a little truck, and we jumped in the truck and we said, take us to the highway, we're gonna hitchhike a ride to Xi'an, to the airport. And then I saw the truck kind of stop for a few seconds, and then it started again, and it started to turn. I looked outside, it was the police station. So we had our suitcases, you know, so I said, let's jump out. We jumped out the back, just as we were going into the police station. And then we went down the block, and they had these kind of three-wheeled, you know, you see them in the small towns, like a motorized. And we jumped in that to take us to the highway, and the whole way I was looking back behind me, you know. And we made it to the airport, we got back. And what bothered me was, the black kilns, most of them were illegal. They were illegal. They weren't paying fair wages. They were making slaves of people, they were kidnapping people. So the police don't go out there with their video cameras, but they go after the poor parents who are trying to find their missing children. So what I found in that a lot of the stories that I did like this, the government was either directly or indirectly responsible, right? Had the government cracked down on these illegal operations, I mean, if you have 15-year-old kids, I remember when we were in Zhengzhou, I'm sorry, it wasn't Xi'an, sorry, it was in Zhengzhou, we went to a shop where the owner's son had been kidnapped, and the son was autistic. You know what autistic means? It's a jump, right? And so he couldn't remember, but he was gone for months, and then just showed up again one day. And he had a big scar in his head, that he must have been hit in the head. And they said he can't, because he's autistic, he can't speak. And all they could do was go like this. He would show his parents, that's what I did. So they figured he must have been working on one of the kilns, and we don't know, they don't know how he got out, how he escaped, but maybe he wasn't of any use as a worker, but he came back home. One of the heartening things is, you know, there was a reporter from Nanfang Ramutokan, and he was now at Esquire magazine, and he did a thing online. He said, everybody donate 10 renminbi, right? That's all, you can't do more, only 10. And he raised money that every month or two when the farmers went out, because Chung and I, we went back, we went to his office, and then he said, okay, where's the receipts? Okay, here's the hotel. They stayed in the cold, it was wintertime. I went to their hotel, I stayed in a small hotel, it was very comfortable, but they were in this cold hotel, no heat, you know, kind of dirty and stuff. They all slept in one room, and it was like, I don't know, like 15 RMB a night or 20. And it just kind of hurt me to see them staying in there. And so they were very careful about how they spent money. Every night we had dinner, we'd be in a restaurant, we're eating, and they would start to cry. And Chung-Yun, he said, after my son disappeared, I started drinking baijiu, because it's the only way I can forget. If I don't drink it, and before I go to sleep, I can't sleep, and I'll have crazy thoughts. So Esquire magazine, the editor, he raised money. He had enough. So many people contributed that he had enough so that every time that they went out, he would cover. They would rent a van. They would stay in small hotels. The train tickets he would reimburse them for. So you know, again, I think I often felt very moved. Okay, so you have this woman who's in the IT business who writes this article called 400, The Blood and Tears of 400 Fathers, that actually gets the whole country knows about it, and she helps them all the time. She's an advisor to them. Then you have, my reporter friend, Jinyu, that took an interest to go down and report on this. And then you have the guy from Esquire magazine who takes time to create a fund so that these families can go out and get their missing children. Later on, after we came back, I went to see Jinyu, and she told me she'd gone back to visit Yuncheng at his house. And she said, I found out what the Bingji, I can't remember her name, the little girl, Yuanjing or something, what she said to her brother. She'd written an essay. Her father didn't know about it. And so what the little girl wrote, 6 years old, she wrote that when my brother left, I went out, and I begged him not to go. And my brother kind of left, and he came back to me, and he whispered in my ear, when brother comes back, I'll bring shoes and dresses for you. And then she said, okay, smooth travels, and he left. She never saw him again. And when I read that, it just broke my heart. That the brother would go back and say, I'm going to bring back nice things for you. She never saw him again. People ignore it. If you have any questions, just raise your hand.
You mentioned that they rescued about 15 people.
50, yeah.
How did they get the kids out? Did they buy them out? Or?
I don't think so. No, I think that because they showed up with like 10 people, the kiln owners were too afraid not to let them take those people out. Yeah. And then like with the one boy, they saw him on the road. But most people were afraid to escape because the kiln owners were so mean, So yeah, no, they said they just kind of would go in. Well, a lot of times it would be apparent, yeah, this is my son, and so they knew that if there wasn't anything they could do. Can you fix that or not? I guess you're all familiar with the AIDS situation in China. In the mid-90s, in mainly Henan province, okay, very poor place, local governments and the PLA began a blood collection program to earn a lot of money, right? And so farmers wanted to make money, so they would sell their blood. I forget how much they got for it. It might have been like 50 or 40 RMB, and then they had to pay 10 RMB so the blood could be tested. And in those days, I don't think that these people understood how to do this. So people would go to the blood collection center. They were all over the countryside in Henan, and say 20 people, same blood type, right? In the room, donate their blood. It went into one container, okay? 20 people's blood in one container, but we're all A- or A- blood. When they donated it, they would separate the plasma, and what was left over, they gave back to the farmers, because they thought, oh, if we do this, they can donate blood more often. But if we're in there, I have HIV, you have HIV. if you have hepatitis C, he has hepatitis C. If he has AIDS, he has AIDS. So you can't do that. You can't mix blood together and then give it back, mix everyone's blood together. So many, they say, it's hard to know. The Chinese government said 60,000 people. Some private sources told me 600,000 people got AIDS in Henan province, right? So they mixed the blood together, and then farmers were going back and forth. This guy here, he had been some kind of legal work in the PLA, and he'd gotten out, and his wife had a baby, and she needed blood transfusion. And so they gave her transfusion. So these blood collection centers were selling the blood to the hospitals. Then the hospitals realized we can make money by giving more people blood transfusions, right? So now you have, the farmers are sick because their blood was mixed together, and now you have the hospitals giving people who don't need blood transfusions. Now, of course, there were a lot of people who were in accidents, women who were giving babies. A lot of the people did need blood transfusions, but the hospitals never checked the blood. The collection centers never checked the blood. And so it became a huge problem in our province. This is that guy then, he took me around this is in Shanxi province, just by the Yellow River. And this is one of the women, and I think she had gotten it from giving birth also. But she's, yeah, that's her mother there. Okay. Can you see her cheeks are sunken in? Her cheeks are quite sunken in. And I was told it's from the medicine. For the first couple of years, the Chinese government didn't do anything. They weren't aware of the problem. Okay? So people had no medicine, they died. And they said most people didn't know what the disease was. They called it the no-name fever or the no-name disease. They didn't know. And doctors in the countryside didn't know what AIDS was. They didn't know how to recognize it. And the person who kind of actually figured this out was, you know, this Dr. Gao Yaojie, right? And she was a pediatrician. She was in her late 70s. And there was one woman in the hospital, and she was quite sick, and none of the doctors could figure out. And although Dr. Gao was retired, they said, oh, can you come and take a look at her? So Dr. Gao examined her and found out she'd given birth a year earlier and had been given a blood transfusion. And then she started asking around, and she figured out what the problem was. And before that, nobody really knew. So you can't blame the government because nobody knew what was happening. But for a couple of years, the government covered it up. They didn't tell anyone. And so a lot of people got infected as a result of this type of thing. And then for 2 or 3, 4 years, there was no medicine. Now, AIDS victims all get medicine for free for the AIDS. But about 80% of them also have hepatitis C. They don't get medication for the hepatitis C. They have to treat themselves. They have to pay for it themselves. A lot of them can't afford it. You can see, you know, the homes that these people live in. Okay, go ahead, Eileen. You know, I started this years earlier. I became interested because there was a report by an NGO about a lack of children's AIDS medicines. So a lot of children got AIDS also from their mothers when they were born. If the mother had AIDS, the children had AIDS. Sometimes the children got blood transfusions. And so what they were doing was there were no special medicine for the children, so the doctors would take the adult dosage and they would cut it in half. But it's not very scientific. So a lot of the kids weren't getting better because the dosage was wrong. And so this report came out, and there was an NGO. Some students from Renmin University had watched the movie Philadelphia Story. Did any of you see Philadelphia Story? Tom Hanks? Is it Tom Hanks? Yeah. Yes. You know, and they were so moved by this, they said, oh, I wonder if there are people like this in China with AIDS. They didn't know. They were PhD students. And so they started looking into it, and so 3 of them formed their own NGO. And they actually got money from Reebok, the shoe company, had given them like some kind of seed money, and they started something called the Kurokata AIDS Law Foundation. So they set up a thing to provide legal assistance to people with AIDS. Okay? So I said to them, I want to do something on the children problem with AIDS. Can you introduce me to someone? They said, oh yeah, there's a little girl in a place called Mianzhi in Henan. And so so Eileen and I went down. We jumped on the train. We went down to Luoyang, and then they picked us up, took us to Mianzhi. And the girl was very sweet. And she, when she was an infant, maybe about 18 months, she got diarrhea, right? She had diarrhea, very small, And the hospital gave her a blood transfusion. You don't need a blood transfusion for stomach problems, right? She lost no blood. Then about 2 years, 3 years later, she started to get sick. Every month, the mother was taking her back to the hospital. And the doctor at the hospital said, oh, your daughter's just a complainer. There's nothing wrong with her. Don't bother me anymore. And then, when the girl was about 14, she got very, very ill. And the mother said, I don't trust the hospital. She drove to Xi'an. A friend of hers drove to Xi'an. And the doctor said, has your daughter ever had a blood transfusion? And she said, no, she got plasma once, but not a blood transfusion. And the doctor said, it's the same thing. And he goes, your daughter has AIDS, and she has hepatitis C, which is also bad. Those two diseases are quite bad. And so the mother knew because now the doctor told us because of the blood transfusion. She went back to the hospital, and the hospital said, oh, sorry, we lost all the records. We lost all the records. There were 100 children in that hospital who got blood transfusion. All the records were lost. Later, I found out that all over, many hospitals did this. Oh, there was a fire, there was a flood. All the hospitals claimed they had no records. But this little girl, her name is Richard, her mother found the receipt for the blood transfusion. So she tried to sue. But the central government had a regulation. No one could sue the hospitals because their children got AIDS. So there was no legal recourse. Well, then the people from these young students from Renmin University helped her, and they introduced her to Ditan Hospital in Beijing, which is an infectious disease hospital. And then there was one reporter from one of the Henan newspapers. And he, because he was so worried about this, he interviewed a lot. I read his article. He couldn't publish it in his newspaper. The editor wouldn't publish it, but he published it in the NGO's magazine. And he interviewed like 20 of these kids, and it was really sad. He talked about them dying, how painful it was, how heartbreaking. And that article gave me so much information. And but when she told the local officials in Manchester, I'm going to Beijing, they said, no, you can't go. They were embarrassed. They didn't want it to get out that they had this problem in Henan province. But the mother was very strong, and she was really strong. She was not very well educated, but like a tough kind of farm woman. And she said, I'm going anyway, I don't care. And she said, if I didn't do it, she was, I couldn't watch my daughter die. And if I didn't do it, she'd be dead today, you know. And so she went to Ditan Hospital, she was treated, and she was getting better. I mean, you can't never get cured from AIDS, but at least it was under control. She still has a problem with the hepatitis C, right? A couple years later, so when we went down there, we spent the whole weekend down there, Saturday and Sunday. We'd go out to eat. The little girl would walk behind us, or she'd walk in front of us. And I said, and then we went to restaurants. Even in that town, a very small town, the restaurants had private rooms. She'd insist that we eat in the private room. And her mother said she's afraid. She left school 2 years earlier because she was too sick. She was worried the other students would find out she had AIDS. And so she didn't want to be seen. And she was afraid if she was seen with me, people might ask questions. And we went around touring, her mother and father, and Eileen and I, and the little girl, we went to kind of scenic places around Manchester, and she wouldn't be in a single photograph. And I said, Randy, we're just kind of, I'm not going to use, I won't use your photo. This is just for you to have like a souvenir memory, you know, I'm not going to show it to anyone. She refused to have her photo taken. And then she was just afraid that somebody would find out. And we went back to her house, and we're sitting in the living room, and then she went into her room, and she came out with 2 big pieces of paper, like this by this. And on the paper were all of her awards. She was a good student, and she'd gotten many awards, and she glued them onto this paper, right? It must have been, like 9 on each one. And when I saw that, I was heartbroken. I had to look away. I was going to cry. And I thought, my daughters are going to school, and this little girl, she's smart, and she can't go to school anymore, And it's really sad. I met a Hong Kong businessman who tried to open schools for the AIDS children in Henan, and the government said you can't do that. They blocked them because they don't want the publicity, So it seems like the officials, their children are safe, but your children are sick, and they're not even going to allow them to go to school, And the government's not doing anything to help these people, And then the mother told me, privately said, actually, Renju is more worried about me than I am about her. And she said, I looked in her diary, and in the diary, Renju had written, And she was maybe 14 at the time or something. She said, I want to see my mother smile again. That's what she wrote in the diary. I want to see my mother smile again. This is I think it's Liu Ximei. And when she was around 12 years old, she was working on a farm in Henan province, and her hair was pulled off, the whole scalp, by a farm equipment. She got her hair cut in equipment, and her whole scalp got ripped off. Can you imagine, very painful. She went to the hospital, she got a transfusion. A few years later, she got AIDS. Her family said, you can't come home. They basically kicked her out. And she had no place to live. And so she went back to the hospital that gave her the transfusion, and they said, oh no, not our fault. And so she just insisted she just lived in the hallway there. She refused to move. And later on, she told me she was going to commit suicide. You know, her family wouldn't take her back. She had no place to live. She was really feeling low. And then she heard there was going to be a meeting about AIDS. And she borrowed like 50 RMB to take the train to that town. And when she went there, she met, do you guys know Ye Haiyan? You know, she's, yeah.
His activity is about to protest the person not voting.
Yeah, you're right, yeah. And so Ye Haiyan had been working with sex workers, with women who were in prostitution to try to help them. And she met Ye Haiyan there. And Ye Haiyan, also kind of concerned about sex workers, but also about AIDS. And so Ye Haiyan took her to Beijing to meet Ai Weiwei. Ai Weiwei gave her a new computer, taught her how to use it, and then gave her like 7,000 RMB. Liu Ximei went back to a small town in Henan, and she set up, it's called Ximei Zhizha, and it was a place when AIDS patients came to the town once a year to get an examination. They had no place to stay. They could stay at her place. It was called Ximei Zhizha, and so she would give them a little bit of money they needed and stuff, and that's how she paid for it. And then she started helping some of the young children. Oh, that's Ye Haiyan there. Go back when I'm. So the little girl there, she was from Henan, and her mother had AIDS. Her father was a drug addict, and he was an AIDS victim, right, because he did drugs. And her mother got blood transfusion when her mother got AIDS from the father. And then when she was born, she got AIDS from her mother, okay? And she was in school, and the other kids knew it, they teased her. Her mother died, her father died, she lived with an aunt and uncle, they died from AIDS. And then she went to live with her grandmother. And she said people would walk by the house and they would throw rocks at the house. And so she was kind of heartbroken. She couldn't go to school anymore. And so Ximei started to help her, tried to get her to go to school and things like that. But she had a very sad life, this little girl. And so Ximei and Ye Haiyan brought her to Beijing in the summertime so that she could kind of see things and do things and get away from the life that she had in this kind of rural area. I didn't want to show her picture because she was only 12 or 13, maybe 14 at the time. Ye Haiyan. Okay. Can you read the Chinese there? Ye Haiyan went to work in a brothel. She worked as a prostitute for 2 days, for free. She didn't charge anyone. And she said she did it because she wanted to know how the girls felt who worked there. She wanted to understand how they felt when they were doing this. And they were doing it for like really poor factory workers. And if you wanted to have sex, it was like 10 RMB or 20 RMB. And she said no charge. And she talked about hugging one guy. She really felt sorry for him. And the guy was so skinny, and his coat was all torn. And she like started to cry, you know. And so when I went to interview her, in my mind I'm thinking, she doesn't sound like a kind of a serious, good person. You know, I had to say, who would do this? Who would become a prostitute for 2 days? I thought she's just trying to get attention. But when I went to see her, she really impressed me. She'd only finished middle school. She was quite articulate. She traveled abroad. She'd gone to conferences on women in different countries. She'd just come back from India when I saw her, and she had another AIDS girl staying with her, another like 12 or 13-year-old girl. And then like 2 days later, I went to meet some other AIDS victims, and I met a young girl, and I asked her what she was doing in Taipei. She goes, oh, you know, Auntie, yeah, invited me to come to Beijing. And then maybe a month later, a handicapped guy introduced me to a farm woman from Gansu or someplace whose daughter was raped at the age of like 2 years old. And now the girl's like 8, and the woman's trying to get some kind of compensation. And when we left, the little girl said to her mother, can we go see Auntie? Yeah. And I went, what? And she said, oh yeah, Ye read about us in the newspaper. We were living in the Xi'an, in the West Beijing train station. Ye went to the train station, found them, and put them in a small hotel and paid for the hotel for them. So Ye did all these things. When I interviewed her, she never bragged. She never said to me, oh, I helped this person. She never said anything about that. Everything I learned about was from she and Mei, or these little girls. So, so I'm quite impressed. Did any of you see the movie about Ye? It's called Hooligan Sparrow. I think it's something like Haiyan Lomang or Lomang Haiyan.
流氓夜
Huh?
流氓夜
Lomang, yeah, okay. And so some of you, it's really worth. It's on Netflix if you can watch it. And basically, some young girls, primary school girls, have been raped by their teachers. I think it was in Haikou, and Ye went down there with some other, with a lawyer, Gao Yu, the famous lawyer Gao Yu, went down with her and stuff, and they tried to get justice for the little girls. And that's when Ye started to get in trouble. She was kicked out of her house. And in the movie, you can see, and Ye daughter's like maybe 15, and they're kicked out, and all of this stuff is on the road. And the daughter's like leaning on her mother's back. Like, it's a very sad photo. Later on, at the end of the movie, all of those things are in a museum in Brooklyn, and it's kind of like installation art. Ai Weiwei had shipped all of their personal goods to New York to put into a museum as a kind of a installation art, protest art. And when I saw it there at the end, it was really kind of very, very moving. This is Ma Guihong. Ma Guihong was from Hebei province. Most of the AIDS victims tend to be in Henan, but she was in Hebei. And I think she also got AIDS from a blood transfusion. And she's quite outspoken. The AIDS victims, very few of them get compensation. But she became an active, and she started complaining. Eventually, she got the Hebei government to give small compensation to the AIDS victims in Hebei province, just because she wouldn't give up. A little bit like Ren Zhi's mother. And okay, another one. Okay, there's the pills. She's showing the pills that she has to take every day. Can you recognize what that tattoo is? I think it might be difficult because maybe it's upside down. She did the tattoo herself, and she might have done it like this. So maybe if that's her arm down like this. She told me that it was Ren, to like endure. So she was so heartbroken before she got the compensation that she tried to commit suicide. But the doctor saved her. And when she came to at the hospital, she said, I can never do this again. And that's when she did this tattoo on her arm for, saying for Ren to endure. I asked her why she sold her blood, and she said to buy shampoo. She wanted to buy imported shampoo. She also wanted to buy clothing for her son who was going to school. She told me she was giving blood 3 or 4 times a week. I didn't believe it was possible. I thought it was physically impossible to give blood that many times. I thought you would get quite sick.